Ready to go? All right. All right, Tom, if you're with us, you want to go ahead and share your screen. Once we get that up and running, we'll introduce you and get started.
Okay. It says host disabled.
Yep, I got to make you the co-host. Sorry about that.
Sorry. It's all right.
All right, while Tom is booting up his PowerPoint presentation for us, I'd like to welcome everyone to our Southeast District ANR webinar. This is our next to last program that we have in our webinar series, and this is a good one as it's going to be 70 degrees outside, and we're all thinking about getting outside and doing vegetable gardening and things in the lawn. Our topic today is Vegetable Gardening 101, and we have with us Tom Springstun from our Scott County office, and he'll be presenting that material to you. Tom, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, and my screen's in the correct mode, right, Kyle?
Yep, it looks good.
Okay, good. Well, hello everyone. I don't know why, the guru gods here for the internet wanted to kick me off right as I was getting ready to go. So I'm going to not share my video for y'all to see my face. I'll wait for that at the end to make sure we get through this. So I can't quite see who all of our participants are, but I was asking some that were in the beginning how experienced in gardening that they were, and whether this is your first time or you're very experienced. I'm hoping that this presentation will give you some other insight or things to think about. And I'm going to say that I'll probably go through here pretty fast, so don't try to take a whole lot of notes as much as just sit back and maybe absorb some. And then if we need to make this presentation available to you later, I can certainly do that. But I want to start out here and really recognize a former Clark County Purdue Ag educator, Simon Kafari. That Simon's really the one had developed a lot of this and gave me the permission to be able to utilize it. And so wanted to do that, but again, recognizing Simon as the one that really put a lot of work in this in the beginning. Wanted to just throw in here the and Justice for All poster, just to make you all aware that federal law and U.S. Department of Agriculture make sure that our civil rights or your civil rights regulations and policies are not impeded or prohibited, and so that we're needing to abide by that, and we're not going to discriminate anybody participating in our programs. Here's just a slide of just all the references that will be mentioned and a lot of the publications and things that will be coming up as we go through this. But kind of diving into this, let's just say on an overview of today, we're going to be talking about basic considerations before you start a garden, and you'll see a layout or a plan, a drawing, and we're going to discuss that a little more. The other thing we're going to do is the basic agronomic requirements for growing plants, whether it's ones that you are growing from seeds or maybe you buy the seedlings and want to transplant them. And then we're going to finish up talking about some common garden pests, diseases, and how to control them. And a lot of times you talk about a disease triangle, and that's what's on the right-hand side, and we'll talk about that some more. So when we say before we start a garden, we want to know our plants. And we need to decide on the type of garden that we want to have, whether it's a vegetable, flower, or a combination of each. We're going to do an early season, a summer or fall, or do we want to garden all year long? So after you decide on the type of garden, you'll need to know what plants you want to put in there. If it's those cool season crops for early spring, like we see our cabbage here, and some lettuce, or we want warm season crops for summer, like our carrots. Do we want to dual season crops that could be in there, like what these beets are, that could be in a lot of seasons? Going to know a little bit of difference between a perennial and an annual plant. Perennial being one that would, once you plant it, it would come back multiple times or years. Annual plants are usually just one time. You plant them and then they're done. So you see the asparagus is on the right bottom. Annual plant might be these tomatoes. Determinate or an indeterminate, there's a difference. The Determinants like they'll grow to a certain height and size and then they're done. You could harvest, or indeterminate would be like many of our tomato varieties that they would go all season long. I'll say that most of this information is easily obtained online or from Extension. And I'll maybe mention too, Kyle, and you can put it in chat, that if folks maybe have some questions as we go along, you could put it in your chat feature on your screen there, and then we'll get to those hopefully here at the end. I wanted to say this, if you would write down HO 186W, that is a number for Indiana Vegetable Planting Calendar. And I'm going to make sure, I'm going to hopefully try this and see that our internet works correctly. But if I was to click on this feature, that would bring up our Purdue Publications store, education store. And this is a free download that you could obtain from them. Very nice publication that goes through. Kyle, are you actually seeing the HO 186 pub? Or is it just on my screen?
We don't see that, Tom. So
all right, so that's just my screen. So I'll shut that part down and go back to my slide presentation then. So on my screen sharing here, yep, let me minimize this. I'm sorry. But the HO 186 publication, so you can Google that. I'll just maybe put a note in here that if you were to Google or make a search for something, if you would put the words .edu in your searches, that's going to bring up all the educational, like universities, research-based publications, instead of like all the .coms and things that are just wanting to, have ads and try to sell things to you. But going on then, we need to know what are our basic traits and characteristics of the plants you want to grow. The vegetative characteristics is your plant's branching, bushy, tall, short, and so on. If we talk about root and shoot characteristics, are they deep rooted, shallow, long, lateral? They have tap or fibrous roots and so on. Talk about a life cycle of the plant, so it's the time from seeding to transplanting, and then a time to maturity, the stage they're most vulnerable, maybe to, like say, some diseases or insect attack, that type of thing. And then if we talk about agronomic and environmental requirements, what's the temperature tolerances? What are common diseases and pests? What is the light and day length requirement, soil requirements? What is the grouping to help with your rotation? And again, we'll kind of get into some of that here. The disease triangle, if you probably can't read the small words, but they're on the bottom left, talks about you need to have a susceptible host, and then you would have a pathogen is on the right hand side, or that would be the bad guy that would maybe want to infect your plants. And then you need to have a conducive environment is there on the bottom left. So you need to have the right kind of weather. Once you would have all that, that's usually where you would have what's showing in the middle is like a watermelon plant with a gummy stem blight. So that's usually how that disease triangle works. And we'll talk about how if you can break at least one of those, of that three-legged stool, then it's not going to be able to occur and at least not have near the severity of if a disease or insect attack was to occur. Again, a lot of this can easily be obtained online or from Extension and publications. And so just to know that there's a lot of information out there. We need to have a garden plan. It's important, especially if you're a beginner, to plan your garden before you get started. And so then you'll see kind of a pretty good, well laid out garden here on the right. But we want to talk about planning ahead and putting it on paper so you know how you're going to do it. You'll see that drawing on the bottom right. That's pretty extensive and color coded even, but You want to determine the layout of the garden from the onset, and you want to list the crop varieties or plants that you want to grow and where you can find them. You want to decide on a rotation plan and determine location for different plants. And when I say rotation plan, it's not necessarily just for this year. That maybe you want to rotate after one crop comes to fruition, comes to production, and it's dying out. You want to take them out and put something else in, but you need to think about it like, say, next year. And one of the things we usually say is to try to cut down on diseases, is in particular like tomatoes and potatoes also. But if you do not plant them in the same locations year after year, you're going to cut down on a lot of your disease transmission that way. So that's when I say rotation plan. Don't just think about this year, but think for future years too. We want to talk about when and where to have raised beds, containers, vertical gardens, and so on. You want to determine what inputs are going to be required and when and where and how you're going to get them. Decide whether you're growing early, late, or full season crops, and determining transplanting time and hence a nursery starting time. Some folks will go out and just buy them as transplants ready to go. Some people take great joy and pride in planting the seeds. So we're getting close to that time to be able to go ahead and do some seed starts indoors. Again, you got to think of the time of when is the weather going to be right for us to move them outdoors and transplant them. So this planning is really a repetitive process of putting it down, anything that comes to mind about current and future gardening needs. You're going to refine that info over and over again as part of improving. And then this is how you're going to make sure it meets your set of objectives within what your climate is or where you're wanting to have or grow your garden. We need to give serious thought to site selection. And we want to select a site at least 6 hours of sunshine each day. Apologize for that. I the only one here at the moment. Secretary went for lunch. So that's gonna mess you up. Sorry. You want a site selection of at least 6 hours. Sorry, I can't turn my volume down over there. Select a location that maximizes the use of that early rising sun. Use land that's well drained with loamy soil. We'll kind of get into some soils here in a moment. When we talk of loamy soils, those are, nice, good, not just some old hard clay soils like we usually have around here. But have some compost maybe incorporated into that to make it nice, loamy soil that you will grow plants well. Think of small space gardening with or without adequate land. You may want to think of raised beds, containers, vertical gardens, and growing towers that may be needed. And there you'll see some pictures of those on the right-hand side. We're going to really start out with a soil test. And so for a soil to be able to adequately support plant life, it needs to be healthy. So doing a soil test will help you know whether or not your soil is healthy. It's going to tell you what nutrients are already in the soil, what nutrients are insufficient or limited quantities, whether they're readily available for plant use, and how they should not be locked up and unavailable. To do a soil test, you could actually use a soil probe, as you'll see some pictures on the right there, or an auger. They're really ideal for taking a soil sample, but a sharp spade or a long knife or trowel can also be used to remove about the same amount of soil for each sampling area. Let me go on to the next few slides, and then we'll talk about where do you get that soil test done? Really, testing once every 3 to 5 years is usually adequate. It's best to test it in the fall. So if you had to have some required amendments, like making the soil less acidic, again, if it's done in the fall, then that'll give you time to get those results back from the test and get prepared with those required amendments. And we talk about doing random sampling. And when we say a soil test, it's not generally go out one spot, stick your probe or auger or the knife or shovel in there and, okay, here's my soil sample. if you'll see on the right-hand side over here, you kind of have it divided by an upland or a hill or some upper land or the bottom land. You'd generally want to consider those into two separate areas because they're kind of dissimilar parts of the land. But all the little X's represent where you would go around and take a soil sample with that probe or the auger, however we discussed. And why you want to do that is that once you take all those samples, you'd put them into a plastic bucket, not a metal bucket, but put them in a plastic bucket as they are then getting all mixed up and combined together. Then you can, it takes about 2 cups worth of soil that you would send off. I know some folks have said, well, I have my own soil test, or maybe I have a pH tester. Those work in some instances, but really you would want to send your sample off to a certified laboratory to really get what we're saying, this basic test, giving you some results of telling you what is your organic matter, the phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium. The CAC is the cation exchange capacity, pH and a buffer pH. We're going to talk a little bit more about those, but really a certified laboratory to do your soil test is the best and most surefire, accurate way to really know what is in your soil. So in Indiana, the only certified lab is ANR Laboratories up at Fort Wayne, Indiana. And I know our office helps to take those samples from homeowners and get them sent up. Usually turns around $15, $25 by the time you ship them for a good soil sample. But like we said here in the beginning of the slide, you really only need to do it every 3 to 5 years. So it's not like you're thinking I'm putting that money out every year. And you may think, well, that's a lot of money, but also think about those inputs. So how much did those seeds cost you if you're growing them yourself to transplant, or how much did the transplants cost? Or how much was the fertilizer inputs that you're putting into it? So you want to really avoid including the top part of the soil with your organic matter at the various stages of decomposition. You'll see on the bottom right-hand side where they've taken some of the soil off in the beginning. And so instead of having all that grass or maybe some dead leaves and grass in the bag on the right side he's putting it into, you're just, making sure you're getting soil and not just all the other organic matter that was on top of it. So when we talk about, do we need to amend or fix the soil? Soil may have an acidity or an alkalinity problem. And if we say that, what does that mean? Well, that's a measure of the soil pH. And that's a measure of the alkalinity or acidity of the soil. You'll see the little scale, pH scale here on the right-hand side. That's 7 right in the middle is neutral. Anything to the left or below 7, it's considered acidic. And anything above 7 to the right of that is alkaline. So again, a best pH range for most crops is a 6.5 to 7. And it's important to know, again, what your soil pH is, because it's going to influence the nutrient availability to plants and hence the soil health. So if the pH is near 7, our nitrification, which nitrification, turning from this NH4 to an NH3, it's kind of like the microbe breakdown in the soil. That process will be fairly fast and rapid. And if it's below 6, it could be quite slow. And this chart on the right is trying to even say that if a pH is really below 6.0, over 20% of the applied fertilizer that you would put on there is wasted, and it gets even worse with the lower pH. So it's showing you here on the right-hand side of a 6.5 pH, there's 0% wasted. If it's 6.0 pH, 20%. It's a 5.5 pH, 33%. and so on, to where if you're down to a pretty acidic soil of a 4.5, 71% of those fertilizers or nutrients that you put on are, when we say wasted, they're just not going to get utilized by the plants. So in essence, yes, they're getting wasted. So alkaline or acidic soils also tend to make more micronutrients unavailable to the plants too. And that's kind of what this last chart on the bottom right is showing. The black line right here in the middle, that's the nitrogen, the sulfur, the potassium are right there, is that NSK. They're kind of on a range from 4.5, it increases better 7.5, but you'll see some things like the phosphorus is the green line. It goes way up at just below 6.5, and that's its best, and then it actually even trails off. If you had some other micronutrients like the calcium, magnesium, this red line, that they're not available when you get too low here of acidic, and they're really available when you get up higher, as an alkaline soil. So what do we need to do if after we have our soil test and we find out that we are really low soil pH, or maybe it is that high pH and alkaline? You can either choose to take your results to a local Purdue Extension office to help on mending your soil, or even do it yourself. A lot of times the report will tell you how many pounds of something that you would need to bring it back to that acceptable pH range. If your pH is above 7, so we're very alkaline, you can use elemental sulfur. And there's a picture over here on the right, just showing the monoammonium phosphate, the MAP, MAP. And if you have the opposite situation, which most of our soils, at least here in Scott County, are pretty acidic, you need to reduce the acidity and get it get it closer to that 6.5 to 7. You could use plain old ag lime that a lot of times farmers would use, and you'll maybe see big piles of it in the fall, and then whether they're a fertilizer dealer or someone comes along with the big loader tractors and spreaders and spreads it out on their fields. You can buy it in smaller bags at hardware stores and whatnot. But that's either calcitic or dolomitic lime is what you would use. And I'll also talk about wood ash. Wood ash could help to reduce the acidity, but you need to caution here at the maximum amount of wood ash that can be added per year is 2 pounds per 100 square feet of soil. So 100 square feet, that's 10 by 10. 10 feet by 10 feet, it's 100 square feet of soil area. If you get any higher than just the 2 pounds, you could have some excess of the potassium, which could interfere with your plant's ability to take up magnesium, calcium, some other nutrients. So I know some folks are, have wood burning stoves and have a lot of wood ash sometimes, but don't make that too thick and too deep and get too much on there. So moving on then, talking about growing plants, we're going to get seed for the garden. Make sure the seeds that you order from catalogs or buy from your local shop are intended for your growing region. And I just say here, the enticing, colorful pictures on the seed packets or in seed catalogs and the marketing lingo they use should not really be your motivator to buying a particular type of seed. I mean, they look really nice and pretty, but when we talk about our growing region, most of us here in Southern Indiana, if you talk about a plant hardiness zone, we're in that 6A, which usually talks about plants could go to maybe 10 to 5 degrees below Fahrenheit and survive. If you're more central northern Indiana, it's a 5B zone, which is like 15 to 10 below 0 Fahrenheit. Most of the plants that you might be putting out in your garden, you might think is being annuals, but still, if you have the perennials, be thinking about it. What is your growing region whenever you're buying some seeds from wherever? You know, it kind of goes along with knowing your climate, because the seeds may not be suitable for here. You know, it may work out west in places or down in Florida, but again, not necessarily here. Need to know the soil type, you know, not only what physical, chemical, biological things that we have there, and the soil test is going to be really the way for you to know what is your pH and that CEC, the cation exchange capacity, that kind of thing. But know your growing conditions for your crop. Like, does it really need sunlight? You know, well-drained soils, daylight time. Again, this may not be suitable for our location. You may need to start the seeds indoor first. So always read what is in the catalogs and on seed packets first, as they contain a lot of good information that will help you in your decision process. Again, the catalogs and the seed packets look very nice and enticing, but you know, may not always translate to what grows well in your garden or for our region. So on getting seed for your garden, you could get those at a local dealer like Ace Hardware or Walmart, Home Depot, Rural King, Orchland, some of those places, and small nurseries. Or again, if we're ordering them through the seed catalogs, just make sure that you're getting those that are good for your location. There may be some seed swap programs. Some communities do, or maybe even master gardener clubs. That type of herb club, that type of thing, may have a program. Watch the paper or listen to the radio on that. And it may be that you process them from home, like you saved out of last year's crop, or you know, those watermelon or pumpkin seeds or something like that. I mean, that in itself is another whole program to know, is this really going to be true, coming back true to the form, or is it maybe going to be some kind of a hybrid or not properly germinate and give you the same, you know, the same crop each year? But a lot of our heirloom tomatoes and that type of things, people really have saved them years to years to years. And, you know, this is what grandma or great grandma, someone else had really planted and utilized. So if you're purchasing seedlings from a nursery, you really want to look for the short, stocky, the healthy plants with the dark green leaves and the stems. Stems need to be straight, starting about the diameter of a pencil. And the main point here is you really want to avoid the plants with the yellowing leaves, spots, or other indications of insect disease or stress. And the biggest thing for me that I sometimes have a problem with, or explain to my wife, is that no, we don't want those tomato plants that already have the flowers or fruits on them, because it really means that they're likely getting overaged. You know, you may be using plants, if you're using plants with a few flowers, you really want to remove them to allow the plant to concentrate on vegetative growth first, and then you know, production or reproduction. Because that's really where the fruit's going to come from, is from those flowers. And if you get them already too leggy, you know, I've heard comments of, well, hey, you already got tomatoes on there, you know, got the crop started. But it's usually, as I said here, it's an indication that the plants are getting overaged. The nursery or the, you know, the hardware or whoever you got them from have held them longer than what was really ideal. And that you're sometimes just opening yourselves up to a lot of diseases or other problems, because those plants were maybe stressed, they weren't watered consistent and all the time. And again, as you see up in the upper right hand picture, you know, this tomato plant's already got some disease and things going on that again, don't invite those. Just start out getting those nice, short, stocky, healthy looking plants with those dark green leaves and the stems. If you do get plants that maybe had the blooms or even suckers, as you'll see in this picture, go ahead and remove those suckers, those extra leaves or branches that's coming off here that would end up being branches. Here that talks about below the scion or a graft union on a grafted plant. That's kind of what the red line is indicating. You You want to remove those because you really want what is your main plant that has been grafted on here. And you want to really just have a nice, good structure and not too many of these suckers that are on the side and that really are going to end up being more of vegetative than they are going to end up being reproduction for you. So on preparing or tilling your garden, you want to turn the soil in the fall or early spring as the soil is workable. Do not turn the soil when it is wet like it is right now, because if you try to go out there and work it too soon, when it's wet, it's just going to remain hard and lumpy and clumpy and just going to have big old clods for the whole rest of the season. You really want to keep your soil disturbance to a minimum. And that, again, it could be a whole course or class in itself when we talk about what worms and microbes and things are there. But it's usually always a good practice to incorporate compost into your garden at the end of the growing season and when you're tilling the soil. A lot of times folks would say, well, where do I get the compost? Okay, it could be that you go buy it, just in bags like this. That you have a, like a Earth First is down around Sellersburg that gets all these kind of wood products and earth from job sites, and they mix it all together to make good compost. Or maybe you have some neighbors that have livestock that have the big old manure pile around back that's really rotted down and a great compost. You wouldn't want to transplant immediately after incorporating the compost because it may take a little time or a little more dissolving. Again, it just depends on the compost you're getting, but it may take a little time for that to dissolve or break down, and you don't want to put plants into a situation where maybe the ground is heating up, while it's trying to break that compost down at the same time you're wanting to plant plants. But here, our last point is after you turn the soil, you can use plastic mulch or other types of mulch to help reduce the weed growth. And additionally, this black plastic will speed up warming of the soil, which is desirable to give an early start for your plants. At the end of the season, where possible, we want to use some cover crops, preferably a nitrogen fixing cover crop like winter rye, buckwheat, hairy vetch, winter wheat. Kind of see a combination of some of those over here. But if you have those type of plants, it's going to give you some winter cover to where you won't have as much wind or possibly water erosion over the winter time. You're going to have some good green growth that you can turn in the springtime whenever we're, again, back to our first point about, don't work the soil too early when it's wet, but whenever it is time in the springtime to work it, you can turn this green cover crop under. That's also more nutrients, more compost that's going to be adding and making your soil lots better. So transplanting into the garden, the best time to transplant is just before sundown. You want to dig a hole about twice as large of the soil mass that you have around the roots. And just like, planting trees or anything else, you want to set the plant at about the same level that they were growing in the pots. You don't want to bury them too deep. You don't want to make them too shallow and have all these roots at the top that will be exposed and dry out. Kind of maybe one exception to that is really tomatoes. Tomatoes are able to develop roots along the stem, so you can, when these plants become too leggy, like you see this picture on the bottom right, it was held on too long. You could plant them at an angle or parallel to the soil, and they will go ahead and make roots along that and generally do pretty well. The only caveat is really the deeper that the roots are planted, the less air that is available to them. So it's best to plant them as close to the original level as possible. I'm going to place the soil loosely around the roots. You want to firm it up and apply about 1 cup of starter fertilizer solution. And you would get that by dissolving 1 tablespoon of a high phosphorus fertilizer in 1 gallon. The phosphorus is the middle number. So in this 15-30-15, it's a nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. And we're going to talk some more about the fertilizer here in just a moment. But putting a starter fertilizer in with that is usually the best way. to help get them off to a good start. You want to protect plants from a direct weather for a few days. I apologize on the phone there. Figured out something. Okay, sorry. If you have plants that are growing in peat pots or these peat pellets that you see over on the right, they can be transplanted in the pots. But as we're going to see here, if you break the base off of that peat pot, just to have the faster way to improve root establishment and the plants recovering after transplanting. But also remember about the tops, and you may need to trim the pot down to the soil level or below to make sure that if you don't, that edge, that top edge of that plant pot may act as a wick and evaporate moisture from the root ball. And this evaporation can delay root penetration or even cause the plant to dry up on hot, sunny days. But again, generally, a rule of thumb is you want to mulch all vegetables transplanted into the garden. And we'll talk about mulch here a little bit more, but mulch could be straw. It might even be newspaper or cardboard. It could even be the wood chips like you might put around the flower garden, the mulching them. But mulching them really helps to not only conserve the moisture, but really to help control the weeds as well. So using fertilizer in the garden, it's guided by really what your soil test results told you that you needed. If your results say that you need basic fertilizer application, it means your soil fertility needs to be amended. And you'd want to first plow in about half of your recommended however many nutrients, N, P, and K that they recommended. You plow that into the soil first. And then if you put the other half on top of the soil and rake it in, this helps to distribute the fertilizer evenly in that top 6 to 7 inches. By again, plowing some of it on, putting it deeper, mixing it in the soil. Then when you put the other half on top and you get rain events or you're watering, then it's going to help take the rest of the nutrients down there. If your soil test results say does not need basic fertilizer application, it does not mean you don't need fertilizer. It just means you only need a maintenance application. You'd want to use a balanced fertilizer for maintenance application. And here's the N, P, and the K. So the N is the nitrogen, the P is a phosphorus oxide, and the potassium is an oxide. Of the K, I should say, is the potassium. And so fertilizers commonly used for maintenance application are listed here. So like you see, a 6-24-24, usually 7 pounds to 1,000 square feet. Another pretty common is a 12-12, so 12-12-12. You'd need 6 pounds of that. The other thing to maybe point out here is when we talk about fertilizer, generally it comes like would be in a 50-pound bag. So you would say that in this case of the 12-12, it has 12% of the nitrogen, 12% of that phosphorus oxide, and 12% of the potassium oxide. So that's how, in a 50-pound bag, that's how you come up with it's 12% of that. Instead of thinking like it's a 100-pound bag, it would be 12 pounds if it was 100 pound, be 6 if it's that 50. So when we talk about using starter fertilizer, these are usually water soluble fertilizers. And here's that 5-10-5 we talked about before. And you take 1 or 2 tablespoons in a gallon of water, let it, again, water soluble, it would dissolve in the water. And then you would apply 1 to 2 cups around the roots. Here they've got it in this jug and they're watering these smaller tomato plants. You would want to side dress with nitrogen. The nitrogen is where you see like this 3400, that's nitrogen only. Maybe as a urea or some type product twos, maybe words on there. You don't want to apply it too soon or very much of it before the plant has made considerable growth, or if you see flowering, because if you do it earlier than this, you can delay your fruiting, could reduce flowers and yields. In fact, you may burn them up even, or if it's too hot of a mixture, too much of this nitrogen product you put on there, you're going to wilt them down and, like I said, burn them up. It's kind of what scenario I would call it. If you're growing vegetables for the home, really it's best to try avoiding chemical fertilizers. Just use organic fertilizers. Examples of those you'll see here, the nitrogen sources are like alfalfa, corn gluten, cottonseed meal. You'll see the animal byproducts are like this dried blood or blood meal, soybean meal, feather meal, and even fish emulsion or bat guano, which is really bat poop. So that's where you think, gosh, that's sounding nasty, but those are again considered organics versus more of a chemical, and like might be the fertilizer that farmers might typically use on their corn or soybeans crops that we're not necessarily going to be eating. Good phosphorus sources are the bone meal, this colloidal phosphate, rock phosphate. Those are pictures over here on the right, show you then the K source or the potassium source. Again, back to our wood ashes. Again, we don't want to put on more than about 2 pounds to 100 square feet. Things like the green sand and the granite dust, I don't think are utilized as much. They're available, but just realize they're a pretty slow release. And the bags and the instructions on that should all really tell you that kind of thing. But they're just to know that they're going to take them longer to break down and be utilized. So it's pretty important to talk about watering our plants. All plants need adequate water throughout the entire growing period. You want to apply water to supplement any rain or only apply it when it's needed. Avoid applying it on the leaves like you're seeing them do right here. But if we want to avoid that, if we can just put it directly onto the soil, and mainly that is because a lot of times folks would come home, whether it's watering the garden, watering the lawn. I used to call it the 5 o'clock sprinkle. They get home from work, they go out there, hey, I need to add some water the lawn or the garden, and they'll put it out there and it goes on top of the leaves. Well, before you know it, it's dark, and then you've got wet leaves that are on there all night long, and it's just more conducive to diseases, things that would be causing problems. So it's best to apply it, whenever you can slowly water it in, let it soak in. If Mother Nature doesn't supply about 1 inch to 1.5 inches a week in a single watering is really when you want to add that. Because, and again, by doing a single watering, it's going to be slow and long, and that your water is going to go down and soak into the soil. Whereas roots tend to form near the surface of the ground if water doesn't penetrate deeper. Shallow-rooted plants are susceptible to wind and drought damage. Because if you think of that, again, if you only do that, maybe you do that 1 inch and a half a week, maybe 3, 4, or 5 times a week, adding that total amount, again, the top surface of the soil is going to be moist or wet, but not the down deep where you want the roots to be able to go down deep to get that water. So whenever we do have drier days, that'll surely be coming in the summertime, then again, your roots are able to sustain it better because they are going down deep where that water's at instead of at the top and shallow. So here again, back to talking about mulching. This is where we're going to conserve that water in the soil, and you moderate the soil temperature and also some weed control. So you see the nice picture over here on the right where it has the plants that are all mulched with straw. And last thing here on this slide is just to recall that potted plants should be watered daily or even every other day, depending on the size of the pot and the temperature. Now, again, these flower arrangements here in these pots are very pretty, but realize that's all the amount of soil that it has. And so, again, not much from Mother Nature, or even if you do get a lot, but a lot of times these are going to dry out pretty quickly. Sunlight warming up your pots. That's why you may need to water them more frequently, if not daily, every other day. As we're sort of getting near the end here, we're going to talk about staking. There are different types of staking and caging materials existing. So type may depend on the crop that you have. What is your objective? It says your imagination and creativity is the limit. We say, why stake plants? Really, it creates a surface, creates a space, ensures accessibility, supports your plants and environmental conditions they may be in. You want to train them to grow upward, and so going towards sunlight. You're going to promote healthy growth and high yield, and reduces disease, pest infestation, and makes management easier. If you were to put on stakes and cages, really, if you do it at planting time, because as we see pictures over here, like I said, be creative. I'm not sure where you get this one in the top middle here, this spring looking water that's around there, but you can imagine that would be kind of hard to get on there after your plants are growing. And particularly, it may be like this, just reinforcement wire, I think is what this picture top right's showing. If you've already got some fruit or you got too much growth and things, the harder to get on there once your plants are established. Could be trellises like you see over here on the left, whether that's tomatoes, it appears, or it could be beans that are going to grow up these poles. Putting them on, staking them as you plant them, that's going to help, again, not only create space and where you can get through here and to be able to get accessible to the fruit and things that you want to harvest. Just a lot of times surely just makes it look a lot more cool and neat, and you can have more space to plant other things. So kind of last topic here is on common garden pests and disease problems. So the first step in controlling those garden diseases and insects pests is to accurately identify the problem. And here the young lady's looking through the magnifying glass, but it's important to know what problem that you might have, because it could be caused by different environmental, mechanical, even a mineral deficiency problems could look a lot like a pest or disease. So you want to try to distinguish between mechanical, hey, did I walk through here, or did I do a tilling and the tiller chewed up some leaves, or, the exhaust on the tiller turned these leaves this way? Could it just be environmental? How many hot, dry days have you had, or is this really a mineral deficiency from insects and our pathogen attack? But after you've identified your problem, I'm going to choose an appropriate control strategy. There could be more than one. You might want to use a cost-effective, most environmentally friendly strategies. And if you use a chemical control, really avoid synthetic chemicals, because a lot of those are going to take out some of your beneficial insects. So last bullet here is, if you can, study the life cycle of common plant diseases and pests, and use the information to avoid the stages of pest and disease life cycle that cause the most damage. Here you see our nice lady beetle over here, and eggs. Sometimes people may think those are bad things, but these are the good guys. And the larvae, and how they pupate, and how these eat a lot of aphids and other bad insects that we don't want. I should point out that some people say, well, how do I know, what this really is? That if maybe even take a picture and send it to the county extension educator, or even our plant diagnostic lab at Purdue, if it's something that maybe we don't have time or have knowledge on, that's where for pretty inexpensive, I believe it's $11 a sample, and pictures even work, to be able to send those up to our pest and disease diagnostic lab at Purdue to help get that problem identified. So back here again, about to wrap up, that as we're recommending that you use synthetic chemicals as a last result. As we look at this triangle over here on the right, you may think about prevention being our base, our first thing that we want to look at. You know, or it could be that we want to do nothing if the damage is within tolerable limits. You know, maybe when we say doing nothing and damage within tolerable, you may think about, well, I'm just going to plant extra plants. So that, sure, I know there's going to be some bugs come along or diseases, that kind of thing. I'm just going to plant extra plants and not worry about trying to control them. But again, back to our triangle here, the base is a prevention. That if you could use and utilize resistant varieties, maybe utilizing something against a fusarium wilt in a tomato plant that's already resistant, then you know you're that step ahead. Creating a non-conducive environment, you know, avoiding the stage of the pest that causes damage and plant alternative host plants for a pest. And we'll talk about that here in just a minute, but thinking of a non-conducive environment, you know, having adequate space for them to grow, watering them at the correct time and not leaving wet leaves overnight, that type of thing. Cultural and sanitation may be the next step. You get crop rotation, spacing, companion crops. And here you'll see companion crops here that were planted together. Sometimes, like marigolds, they talk about they are deterrent to a lot of other insects and things. You know, I believe in that and seen it work. Mechanical, using like traps, stickers that you'll see, like the sticky trap to control them. I never tried the vacuuming, but evidently they have vacuums that you could suck those beetles right off and get rid of them that way. Biological might be the natural enemies to control pests, and these the BTs or the Bacillus thuringiensis, a lot of those parasites, that type of thing. Sometimes I didn't realize this until after really got into extension myself. You know, whether you call this a tomato hornworm or tobacco hornworm, you'd see these that have these white eggs or things on their back. And you think, oh my gosh, you know, pick that off and get rid of them. But actually, this is a parasitic wasp that has stung this hornworm, and that's its eggs, and it's actually doing its thing, in that it is eating the insides out of this hornworm, and he's going to die and perish. If you picked it out and threw it away, then you would have no more of these wasps that would develop to carry on that, you know, to make other make other wasps and come do the same thing, lay eggs and other hornworms. You see the lady beetles over here. This is the larvae eating on all these aphids. Last thing here we talked about then is if we can exclude them. Maybe you can have a row cover like we see up here to the top. Having some repellents like doing the marigolds or doing some snail or slugwire. Again, if it comes down to it, using chemicals, do that as a last resort. Do that as these, use the non-synthetic. So biorational, botanical insecticides. Here's where we talk about the stomach poisons or the BT products. There's oils, soaps, neem oil, insecticidal soap, those type of things. So a lot of products out there that really would be better done than trying to do some other harsher chemicals that you think of having to, then you don't have to pay as much attention to the withdrawal times or withdrawal before harvest, restrictions, that kind of thing. So here's our end, and we hope you get to enjoy your fruits of your labor. I'm going to stop sharing, Kyle, and see, do we have some questions?
Okay, I don't have any in the chat, right, Tom? But if you have any questions, you can put those in the chat box. You could unmute and ask Tom if you have questions.
Hi, Tom. This is Mary. And last year I started a garden after many years, and I had a bad problem with squash bugs. Um, do you have anything that would get them under control? Because I read somewhere that once you get them, you're going to have them all the time. Is that true?
I would say it could be. I mean, it's kind of like you plant it, they will find it, kind of thing.
Okay.
But knowing maybe when to expect them or trying to do some rotation, that might be one of the things too, Mary. Those cucurbids are kind of like the tomatoes. If you can rotate where you plant them each time, be sure and do a good cleanup at the end in the fall so that you don't have all that product left there and overwintering, and that more enticing for them.
My husband thought about stacking some brush on top of the garden this spring and burning it. Would that help or not?
You might get rid of some of that's there. I just want to make sure you're not sterilizing the soil too.
That's true.
Too much.
Okay.
A lot of times those, I was going to say like a carbaryl or a 7 SEVIN is the trade name, but a lot of those really, that to me, if we were to use chemicals, that's one of those more user friendly and less harvest restrictions if we were using any.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I do have one other question. When you plant corn and it comes up and it has suckers that comes on it, should you pull those off or leave them on it?
There's some varieties that are more prone to that than others, but I would generally say take them off because you're just taking away from the plant's ability to put all its energy into making that, corn, ear of corn. And suckers really are not ever going to produce that. So I would say generally, yes, you'd want to take those off.
Okay. I kind of thought that, but I got online and you read all kinds of stuff and it said to leave them. And afterwards, I thought I should have taken those off, but I thought I'd ask you.
Yeah. Good question.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, while we're waiting on a few other questions, I'm going to launch a poll. So you should be able to see a poll come up on your screen. If you can just answer that for us really quickly about today's program. Then if you have any questions, please put those in the chat box, or you can feel to unmute. Okay, we'll take just a few more seconds. Anyone have any more questions, please unmute or tap those in the chat box.
Yeah, appreciate everybody joining us today. And I think that Kyle, I guess you were probably going to tell them about, there is one more program in this series. And if someone needs a copy of this, I should have put my email in there, but it's tsprings@purdue.edu. You could put that in my chat here.
All right, Tom, we do have a question on the chat. Another question. It says, besides marigolds, what other flowers are beneficial to deter bugs?
Good question. I should know that, but it's not coming to mind at the moment. Who's asking? Kelly?
Kelly, so.
Yeah. Does anyone else, or Kyle, can you think of what other plants, flowers?
Nothing's coming to my mind either right now, Tom.
Just thinking too, Kelly, and to everyone, that a lot of times just thinking of planting more plants than you think you might need for your family or for whatever your needs are. And if maybe we do get too many bugs or diseases attacking, then, it kind of goes back to that. What's your acceptable level of, hey, I'm just going to plant extra and let the bugs or disease get it, but I'll still have a lot of good fruit and things to harvest for ourselves. but good question, Kelly. I'll see what I might be able to find out on other plants.
So Kelly, you might take down Tom's email address. You can maybe email him directly and kind of work with him on that individually, maybe.
Yes, that would sound good.
Okay, any other questions for anyone? All right, we have one more series left in our ANR webinar series that we have, and that is on parasite management. And that is on March the 9th, starting at noon. So it'll be all things parasites. It's more on the animal side, but it's going to be another great program as we kind of wrap up our series for the year. So thank you very much for your attendance, and we hope we'll see you in a couple weeks. Thank you all.